Despite the initial focus on the potential for the expansion of communism in Europe, really the earliest hotspot of the Cold War is going to be in Asia. In 1949, China officially becomes a communist nation, with the Chinese winning the long enduring civil war. The Chinese communists winning the long enduring civil war. So, communists and nationalists in China have been at war with one another over the control of China since the early 1900s, the fall of the um, Qing dynasty in 1911 had led to a little bit of an unsteady period in Chinese politics. Following that, the initial Republic of China, and then the struggle over the future of China between communists and nationalists. And in 1949, the nationalists under Jiang Jieshi, or you may also know his name as Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan, leaving mainland China to the communists under Mao Zedong. Both the nationalists in Taiwan and the communists in mainland China claim to be the legit China. So this led to a somewhat sticky situation for a long time in the Cold War over who do you officially recognize as China, because the nationalists in Taiwan were much more democratic leaning and capitalist versus the mainland China, obviously the bigger population of Chinese people, but communist. This alarmed the United States and other Western allies when China became communist because this was clearly a failure of this containment policy. We hadn't been able to prevent China from becoming communist. We now have a huge population in the world now living under a communist state. And there's this very real concern that the Soviet Union and China will now become BFFs, close allies. The reality, though, is if you looked at communism, the communism of China and the communism of the Soviet Union were very different from one another. And oftentimes they violently disagreed with one another over policies and ideas. The communism in China was far more sort of, yes, we should aggressively expand, whereas the Soviet Union was a little bit less of the we need to achieve worldwide revolution strain of communism. And nevertheless, though, to the outside world, a communist was a communist was a communist. There wasn't really a big attempt in the United States, at least popularly, to differentiate between these different forms of communism. So, with China becoming communist, this leads to a directive known as NSC 68, which is a further directive related to containment. So, containment now becomes truly global, with the United States no longer just committing aid, but also committing, if necessary, troops to go in and to prevent the spread of communism. So now we're backing up. We're putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak. We're no longer just saying we'll provide aid. We're now explicitly saying we are willing to get involved in military exercises and engagements to prevent the spread of communism. And that actually happened pretty quickly with Korea. So Korea was one of these sliced up nation states that were very popular at the end of World War II. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel, with Northern Korea occupied by the Soviets and Southern Korea occupied by the United States. What was supposed to be a temporary division became more permanent in 1948, with Southern Korea officially forming the Republic of Korea, okay, led by an anti-communist and fairly conservative President Syngman Rhee, and Northern Korea becoming the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, led by Communist President Kim Il-sung. The problem with this now separate division in Korea was that both Koreas claimed to be the real, legitimate Korea that should have control of all of Korea, not just half of it. Both leaders claimed to be the true head of a single sovereign Korea, and the other leader was just some dude who was trying to steal territory. So this will result in the Korean War, which begins in 1950 technically is still ongoing because they've never signed a peace treaty. The North Korean government invaded South Korea in 1950, capturing the capital of Seoul and declaring that they were doing so to reunify Korea under what they again claimed was the legitimate Korean government. This was the first military engagement for UN peacekeeping troops. So the United Nations will send in troops from a coalition of member nations, including the United States, to push the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel and defend South Korea. And the thinking among the UN was that the Soviets must have encouraged this invasion into Korea. The United States, meanwhile, under generals like Douglas MacArthur, believed that while they were there in Korea along the 38th parallel, the borderline, they had a good opportunity to unite Korea under the leadership of South Korea. That would install an American friendly government in Korea, and then again, capitalist and democratic. And so the United States troops, without the support of the United Nations peacekeeping guys who were like, look, this is not, we've done our job, we've restored the border, American troops launched an invasion of North Korea, and they invaded and occupied the capital of Pyongyang. Meanwhile, the Chinese, again, remember, communists for about a year now, warned the United States that they were infringing upon the Chinese sphere of influence, and if they continued their invasion of North Korea, that China would become involved as well. In the end, a combined Chinese and North Korean force pushed the Americans back over the 38th parallel by 1951, and both sides spent the next 2 years in an effective stalemate at the border between North and South Korea, which resulted in the deaths of about 3 million Koreans, mostly civilians. At the end of 1953, both sides declared a ceasefire. Again, this is largely what's been in place since 1953. There have been recent overtures towards finally signing a peace treaty and formally ending the war, but technically the conflict is still on. With the Korean War, there was a real concern that Asia would now become the forefront of the attempt to contain communism. And so the United States and other nations formed SEATO, or the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was basically an Asian version of NATO. They were especially concerned that the main democratic capitalist nation left in Asia, other than South Korea, at that time was Japan, okay, which again we had recently been at war with. So as we get into the early 1950s, there is a definite concern over the direction of the Cold War. We had already seen both sides at this point develop atomic bombs. We had already seen increasing conflict and stalemate between the Soviet Union and the other allies in Germany with the Berlin blockade. We'd seen it in Korea with the Korean War. And many people criticized the Cold War at this early point in time for being a conflict that was constantly framed as black or white, that there was no middle ground, no shades of gray in between. It was either the communists are completely right or the democratic capitalists are completely right. And many people criticize this, especially as we'll talk about in a future installment, these newly independent nations that have formerly been colonies. They really don't want to get involved in the Cold War and would rather have an option C rather than choose between just the Soviet Union and the United States. There's also going to be, as we're going to talk about at home in the United States, a real problem with how the Cold War is applied at home. There's this sense of needing to subject Americans to a purity test that expressing any kind of support of a political idea leaning to the left, socially smacked of communism. And as we're going to talk about, this has a pretty chilling effect on things like free speech and on certain rights movements, especially the civil rights movement. And lastly, as I've briefly touched on, we're going to see a process known as decolonization after World War II. So all of these former colonies of places like Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain are going to start to become independent, whether given their independence voluntarily or whether they end up in wars for independence and taking their independence from their former imperial nations. And that's going to be a messy process as well. Particularly, this is going to lead to a lot of conflict involving the US and the Soviet Union through a phenomenon known as proxy wars that we'll talk about in a future installment. So, in other words, the United States and the Soviet Union aren't directly fighting each other, but they're bankrolling opposing sides. And in particular, we'll see this in two main places we'll talk about a lot in the future: Vietnam and Afghanistan. So that concludes our session on the origins of the Cold War. In future installments, we'll talk about the problem with a black and white approach to politics during the Cold War at home, when we talk about Joseph McCarthy and the phenomenon of McCarthyism. And we'll also talk about how containment and this desire to stop the spread of communism will get us involved in what is essentially a decolonizationist movement in Vietnam.